Today, I want to talk about alcohol and how it affects memory. Mainly, I want to talk about something called an alcohol induced blackout. This isn't about passing out, but instead, it's an interesting phenomenon where people are able to interact and seem like they're aware of what's going on around them, but the neurobiological mechanisms to form memories of those things are disrupted by alcohol. Understanding why this happens helps us understand how alcohol affects the brain and why blackouts are a warning sign. For a long time, alcohol induced blackouts were thought to happen only to alcoholics, and they were considered a prominent warning sign of alcohol addiction. But now we know that blackouts can happen to people who don't consider themselves alcoholics, but they're still a strong indicator of excessive drinking. In short, the blackouts don't happen randomly, but they happen when the brain is overwhelmed by alcohol. The big reason why blackouts are considered an indicator of alcohol use disorder is that most people with alcoholic addiction experience multiple blackouts early in their drinking history. Even among young social drinkers, those who have blackouts tend to drink more often, they drink more heavily and quickly, and they consume more drinks per occasion. So, to understand why blackouts happen, we need to talk about the hippocampus. This is a structure in the temporal lobe of the brain that is key to learning and memory formation. It integrates signals from around the brain for things like sensory information, episodic information, emotional information, spatial information, and other contexts into short term memories or associations. And without it, events don't get recorded or recorded properly. When the hippocampus is impaired or damaged, people can still talk, think, and act. And this does happen in other conditions, think like dementia, Alzheimer's, but they can't reliably form new memories. At the cellular level, memory depends on something called long-term potentiation in neurons. Think of long-term potentiation as the brain strengthening connections between highly activated neurons so that the learning sticks. This happens through molecular mechanisms inside the cells. So when a neuron is receiving signals from an adjacent neuron through neurotransmitters, that produces some gene expression, for example, inside the cell that may result in expression of more of a neurotransmitter or more of the receptor for a neurotransmitter. And it changes how that circuit functions, reinforcing it. So, this is long term potentiation. So, alcohol interferes with long term potentiation essentially by slowing activity at these synapses. It does that by increasing GABA signaling, which is throughout the brain. GABA signals neurons to slow down their responding. And then it also acts on glutamate receptors, which are also throughout the brain and in the hippocampus. There's a subtype called NMDA receptors that are important for memory, and it slows those down as well. And slowing down glutamate receptors, glutamate receptors are excitatory, and that also decreases activity at those neurons. So alcohol speeds up the signal to slow down, and then it slows down the signal to speed up, summing up to a slowed signaling connection. And this disrupts long-term potentiation. So as we drink more, that gets disrupted and people cannot form new memories. And interestingly enough, this can actually happen if you have an interaction with someone, if you do something before you start drinking, if long-term potentiation hasn't had time to take effect, you can actually disrupt memory formation of something that happened while you were sober if you immediately consume alcohol afterwards heavily. At a behavioral level, people respond very differently to having blackouts. For some people, they may be afraid that they've had a blackout. A lot of people would rightfully be concerned that they don't remember what they did. Maybe they got home and they don't remember how they got there. Maybe someone's told them that they did something embarrassing or dangerous or something the night before and they can't remember having done it and they find that frightening. And for some people, they will take that as a concern and they'll understand that they should not drink that heavily or maybe that they should stop drinking altogether. Maybe I realize they have a problem. But for other people, some people continue to drink knowing that they've had blackouts or a blackout, and they don't really concern themselves with it, or maybe they even like talk about it and they like think it's funny or something. So if you respond to having a blackout without some concern for yourself, then that might be an indication that you have an alcohol use problem or that you might develop one. Another mechanism that's really important for memory and that alcohol disrupts is sleep. So with sleep, we need to get to REM sleep multiple times a night in order to consolidate memories into long-term memory, and it also helps us reset, like, our emotional health, our thinking and whatnot. People who have problems reaching REM sleep, they can have all kinds of cognitive issues. Alcohol specifically helps us enter slow wave sleep, so people a lot of times will fall asleep easier when they drink. This is something plenty of people experience, but slow wave sleep is not the kind of sleep that we need to restore our brain health every night. So, alcohol limits the amount of times that we enter REM sleep and can prevent it altogether if you've drank heavily or if you have a chronic use problem. So, this is another thing that alcohol disrupts. The mechanisms for that are pretty complicated, and I actually would like to return to sleep in a later video. Now, consistent with the theme of some of these other videos, alcohol, so far we've discussed the short-term effects of alcohol on memory, but it does have long-term implications. Um, One of the things about the hippocampus that's interesting is it is a hotspot in the brain for neurogenesis. So we generate new neurons in our hippocampus, even into our adult lives. This happens in other parts of the brain too, but especially in the hippocampus. And alcohol does seem to deplete the number of new brain cells being formed, and it reduces the number of progenitor cells that can form neurons in the hippocampus as well as elsewhere in the brain. So this, even if you quit drinking, like the reduction in those progenitor cells, especially, that can have long-term implications on how well your brain ages, for example. Another thing that we see in the hippocampus is that you get reduced white matter volume. So white matter is specifically referring to these specialized glial cells that wrap the axons of neurons, and they're necessary for action potentials that carry signals from one neuron to adjacent neurons, especially over a distance. So if we have reduced white matter, that can impair the ability of the neurons to have axon potentials, to have action potentials, pardon me. Then the good thing about the disruption to the white cells is that over time, if you take away the alcohol, glial cells will recover to some extent from damage. And then the last thing that I want to talk about here, this is also something that would be a good subject for another video, is thiamine deficiency. So there's a condition called Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome. And with the Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, it is a severe thiamine deficiency. Alcohol interferes with our body's ability to absorb alcohol, or not alcohol, to absorb thiamine, as well as our ability to process it in the liver and for, it to get to our brains. And with decreased thiamine, we end up with a bunch of cognitive issues. Like you'll have balance issues, you'll have cognitive issues, and you'll have profound memory loss. And if we don't recover that thiamine deficiency, it can result in permanent brain damage. One thing that we see with thiamine deficiency is when people present to the clinic after a long period of chronic drinking, they'll present with what looks like dementia, and one of the things that they will rule out is a vitamin B or thiamine deficiency to see if, that could be a cause of dementia. The good thing about it is it's usually reversible unless, like I said, it's persisted for a long time and you have some permanent brain damage. Again, I'd like to return to the thiamine deficiency in the future in another conversation, but it's definitely an interesting mechanism that is associated especially with chronic alcoholism. So that's my summary of alcohol and memory. It's a more complex issue than that as well. These are just kind of some of the key mechanisms. Alcohol blackouts are definitely a sign that the brain is under serious stress. And so the most important part of this is that memory loss is the brain's way of warning us that the brain is under too much stress. If you notice that you're having memory issues from drinking, or if you see that somebody around you is having memory issues, a lot of times, they won't notice that they've had like a memory blackout, especially if it's a short one, but you'll notice that they don't remember something important. It is an indication that they need to see a doctor or perhaps get some help with their drinking. But I do like to leave these videos also with some positive takeaways. In this case, I would like to say, like, Long-term potentiation is a molecular mechanism inside the neurons. If you take away the alcohol and you return the neurons to their normal pattern of responding, they will form new connections. They will continue to function. A lot of times, like they can recover mostly or entirely once you take away the alcohol. Also, some of the cell types, like I mentioned, like the white matter cell types, those can recover with the absence of alcohol. And even if you've lost some of your neuronal volume, like if you've managed to kill some neurons with with alcohol use, the neurons that remain can form new networks and you can recover even network wide connections without some of the neurons by the ones remaining taking over. I produce these videos in part because of things that have happened to me and my family. I have a PhD in neuroscience. I try to use these topics to help myself understand things that have happened to people around me. It does help me find empathy and compassion for others. If you have someone in your life that is drinking heavily, or if you yourself are drinking heavily, I do encourage you to at least find like an AA program or Al-Anon if you are a family member of an alcoholic. It's a good place to start to get help. Honestly, like most people cannot quit drinking on their own without help. I definitely recommend that you seek out professional help from your physician, through your regular physician, through a psychiatrist. Um, Definitely, alcohol is a serious problem. It has been a serious problem for me and my family. Um, so if you do like this content, if you want to make any comments about what I've said here, if you have any ideas for anything else that you'd like to learn about alcoholism, I do want to get into some other neuroscience topics as well. Just share them in the comments below. It really does help me out if you like this video and if you subscribe to the channel, and I will try to continue to provide new content in a timely manner. Thank you for paying attention.